Hi, I'm Richard Niles. Over the years, I've had so many messages about these radio shows I did for the BBC back in 2005. Some of the greatest musicians, people like Pat Metheny, Randy Brecker, and Michael McDonald, not only explaining their process, but I got them to demonstrate their concepts on their instruments. I'm really glad to be able to bring you these shows, and if you enjoy them, check out my books shown here. Okay, enough of this shameless plug. Let's start the show with my theme song for Inside Improvisation.
Inside Improvisation. Inside Improvisation with Richard Niles.
Okay, I admit it, I am Richard Niles, but that's no reason to miss this second fun-packed edition of Inside Improvisation. Last week's jam gave us a clue as to where all those crazy notes come from and how musicians have to practice like Billy-O to play the right ones. This week, we're going to look at all the different ways improvisation can be taught. And who better to ask than the very tall tenor player and composer Frank Griffith, head of jazz at Brunel University, who reminds us that improvisation was originally an important part of classical music.
Many of the composers, of course, in the Baroque and classical era were improvisers because the nature of their performance required killing 5 more minutes or whatever, cadenza-like passages that required improvising. I think a lot of that was submerged in the later eras. I think that's slightly coming back. I mean, you have many composers today who do incorporate improvisers into their music.
What are the difficulties in teaching classical musicians to improvise?
I think it's just too many new things given to them suddenly. One of them is a new way of learning scales and chords. They're taught to memorize their scales for their tests, for their exams. A jazz musician or an improvising musician will often memorize a scale relative to the key that they're actually in of the song. So it's a new way of learning old information is one difficulty. Another one is many of them don't actually learn about jazz until they start improvising. So they don't have hours, days, months of listening. So they have to learn about the two things simultaneously, which makes it difficult. So I start with classical music themes, very simple Grieg-type ditties, and of course folk music, calypsos, things that are quite triadic and simple in chord structure, and melodies as well. We like to use Sonny Rollins music, which is very engaging to a listener who hasn't really got stuck into jazz. Things like St. Thomas, of course, and many of the calypso things he wrote in the 50s.
Sophisticated composer and New York jazzman David Chesky feels that schools have to do a lot more to combat our MTV culture.
With the advent of the television and MTV, we've become a visual society. The metaphor used to be the word. We used to live in an abstract time, think, listen to music attentively. Today, the metaphor is an image. I believe that young people do not have the capacity anymore to listen to music attentively. They can listen while they surf the net or while they do other things, but when I grew up, you had no internet and things like that, and you sat down, whether you bought a Beatles record or Shostakovich, you sat there with your friends and you listened attentively. But for some reason, music has become background. I think this is a flaw due to the education system in this country. We don't put a value on it. You know, at the end, you get the culture you deserve. But if you don't teach art in school, you're not going to develop a consumer base later on.
You're listening to the young New York violinist Regina Carter doing her thing on Gershwin's Lady Be Good in my studio. Her natural groove was a result of learning violin by the Suzuki method. Now, Dr. Suzuki teaches music to children as young as 3 years old in the same way as we learn language, by listening, absorbing, and copying.
It's a method where children are taught by ear. They learn by imitating, just like we already do anyway as children. We repeat what we hear, and that's how we learn to speak. You hear music, you're given sounds, and until you can repeat those sounds, singing it back, and you're given a lot of material to listen to because you're absorbing that. Even though adults don't realize that they're getting ear training when they go into the supermarket or the shopping malls and they hear music, and you hear a tune enough, then you can sing it, and no one taught it to you. So it's the same way that children learn. What's great about it is it frees you up from looking at notes. With the ear training, you're not stuck to the page. You're not afraid to be off of music, off of notes, because basically you've learned it by hearing it, and you're not going to forget it. You store it inside your body somewhere, and you don't forget it. By the time you learn how to read, you're associating what you already hear to what's on the paper, instead of doing it the opposite way. And I think it gives people a lot more freedom to know that they can trust their ear to kind of lead you and guide you, and you don't need a piece of paper to tell you what to do. And the thing about improvisation, because it's something that you're making up on the spot anyway, paper's not going to help you out. After they get comfortable with it, then yes, they'll say, okay, this is a perfect fourth, da-da. And then maybe a way to remember that, you start labeling it, like da-da, I think of Here Comes the Bride, da-da-da-da. So just in a matter, that's how I recall it. Everyone does it their own way. Some people do it with colors. They hear that as red. It's just however you can make the association without seeing it on a piece of paper. And it's a lot of fun then, instead of it being so technical, because I think a lot of times that's what turns people off. And with music, you just want to play a song right away. Then kids get really excited because they're playing something.
Danny Gottlieb certainly deserves the title of the most versatile drummer on earth, having played with Pat Metheny, John McLaughlin, Eliane Elias, and the Blues Brothers. He told me how he learned his incredible use of dynamics.
I studied with one of the greatest improvisers on the drums. I still am studying with him. I've been around him for 35 years. That's the great Joe Morello, the drummer with the Dave Brubeck Quartet for 12 and a half years and played on the famous song Take 5. And he, in turn, studied with one of the greatest snare drummers in history in America, a guy named George Lawrence Stone, who had a specific technique on how to hold the sticks and how to play dynamics. I have a way of really controlling the sound, so I can play very soft, medium, and very loud, which then adds into the improvisational parts.
Can you give the listeners a little example of your incredible facility with dynamics, where you can go from a scale of 1 to 10?
And that's exactly what it is. I'm hitting the drum from a different height each time I play. For example, I'm going to hit the drum from a very low height. I'm barely touching it. Now I'm going to slowly get louder just by raising the stick higher. And I'm not doing that by squeezing it harder or like whacking it harder. I'm hitting it from a higher starting position.
So you're letting gravity do the work.
That's exactly what it is.
The great trumpet player Clark Terry had a simple yet profound formula for all students: imitate, assimilate, and innovate. Once you've mastered the theory, studied the tradition, and learned from the masters, how does a musician make that last leap? How does a little musical caterpillar metamorphose into an innovator? How does a musician find their own voice? Gary Burton found it on the vibraphone by picking up 4 mallets instead of just the 2.
That was a result of the circumstances I found myself in as a young musician. I grew up in a farm town in Indiana, and there were no other musicians to play with, and I played alone a lot. My older sister had taken piano lessons, and since the keyboard of the vibraphone and the keyboard of the piano are the same, I started doing this too. I felt that playing the vibraphone by myself was too empty. I needed harmony. Even though at first it seemed impractical to play with 4 mallets in a continuous way, I just sort of kept messing around with it, developing this pianistic keyboards approach to the vibraphone. I set about finding my own way of playing the instrument. This is the toughest thing to teach. Everybody seems to know that it's important to find their own style and their own voice, but it's the most difficult thing to try to explain or give them any insights into or any shortcuts to. It's really part, in a way, of our personality, and it's very hard to change your personality. Everybody can talk. And yet some people are far more interesting talkers than others. And some people have a much more effective delivery. We can all talk, but there is a difference. Sometimes the style that you end up having as your own just isn't that unique, doesn't stand out from the other players of your instrument, and so you don't get as much attention for originality. And other times, your playing happens to be very clearly original and unique, and you benefit from it, but we don't have a lot of control over it.
Young gun Yannick Guizdala uses classical guitar and flamenco techniques to express his unique virtuosic style on the bass. He stresses the importance of constant study.
You can't really go forward and create a unique voice, which I personally think should really be the goal if you're creating improvised music, unless you understand what has gone before you. To take on board all that knowledge as much as you can, and to never stop taking on board that knowledge, never to be closed to any new kind of music, and using that palette of colors to project what your emotions are. There's the whole school of thought that, well, to be original, you can do anything you like and just play whatever nonsense is happening in your brain at that time. It's not really like that, You really have to have a solid working knowledge of the music. And it also doesn't work without a serious, lifelong, 50, 60, 70 year, however long you're lucky enough to be alive, commitment. Always listening, your mind is working and you're taking in everything around you. There's always something you can learn. Technology affords you a few more colors to your palette as far as improvising goes, and it's just finding what you think is unique to yourself and trying to be original with it. Just keep your ears open, definitely listen first and play second.
Fellow Brit sax whiz Chris Hunter explains how he used theoretical study to find his own unique style.
In the jazz environment, you are really there more to establish your own identity than you are to worry about other people's considerations. Something that really has been a driving force in everything I do. Just putting notes together in sequence that really no one has thought of before. In bebop, people are dealing with essentially what is a diatonic scale and dividing that into arpeggiated forms. I'll just demonstrate some of that, So what I'm trying to do is use some of the same notes, but in a slightly different method, okay? Everybody's got to deal with the same 12 notes. That is the dilemma we face, And it's the thing is, if you just wanted to put the time in, I'd figure out a way of just putting them together in a slightly more perverse manner than the last guy.
Many musicians achieve musical satori from a great musical guru. Gary Husband told me how Miles Davis gave the improvisation dharma to the guys in his band.
His particular magic was to take musicians and get something out of them that even they didn't know they had in them. Miles Davis was the master of the understatement. What was the story about Coltrane when he says, once I get on this chorus, I just can't stop playing and searching. I can't stop. Yeah, try taking the horn out of your mouth.
Gary's bandmate in Level 42 is the great bassist Mark King. His unique slapping sound is achieved courtesy of the godfather of soul himself, Mr. James Brown, who preached the gospel of accenting the one, meaning the first beat in the bar.
It is the rhythm. The one is always important because people very often don't go, Now, if you don't know where the one is, and then if I click it round onto the one, the drummer suddenly looks as if I've jumped out of time. If you're lucky, you get a good sort of 3 minutes of paranoid schizophrenia.
The harmonica has had few well-known improvisers. The big guys are Toots Thielmans and Stevie Wonder. The new contender is Grégoire Marais, the young Swiss phenomenon who has recently joined the Pat Metheny group.
I'm really trying to find me in the instrument. You know, I never started the harmonica because I heard Toots or I heard Stevie Wonder. I discovered them later, and they were a huge influence on me. But I think I have something unique, just as they have. Because it's very easy to always copy other people. It's very hard to find your own way. But once you find your own way, it's just so much more rewarding. You feel like you haven't cheated.
Pianist Andy Milne of the group Dap Theory plays in a rhythmic style that he thinks of as a conversation between his two hands.
Well, I think a lot about rhythmic relationships like I do interpersonal relationships, but just be able to play together but independently. This is the song Trickle Down.
Some improvisers create a unique voice playing duet. In the case of Brazilian pianist Eliane Elias and legendary bassist Mark Johnson, the communication between them is quite special and shows off Eliane's breathtaking abilities as an accompanist.
I think that's an art. First of all, it's listening to the soloist. What the soloist is saying is a conversation. Give a feedback and at the same time give little responses that may also create some kind of a musical environment for him to go into something new. And that's what keeps making it new every night that we play. I always call like putting a very comfortable, delicious pillow for the person to lay on.
She's the bass player's dream accompanist. This is a prime example of me playing a note, listening to what she plays, and having that stimulate me into another note.
In a world where everybody and their uncle plays guitar, including me, British guitarist Martin Taylor took a very non-technical path to find his own way of doing it.
I'd always been fascinated by instruments that are self-contained, like the guitar, the piano. I wanted to be able to improvise like that, because I used to work with piano players that would play solo and the freedom they had. So I actually got a lot of things from the piano. One of the things is like playing in tenths. So here's a well-known tune that works on this, like this kind of thing. So I started to think about the bass line being there. Then bring a top line in. But then you can bring little things in the middle. That really comes from piano playing. Something else takes over, it just becomes a feeling. You've got that knowledge and know-how, you know the way things work, and you just use that then as a tool, because that's only a tool, because anybody can learn to play a musical instrument. But to play music, that's a completely different thing. To actually have something to say, somebody can learn to speak a language, but actually having something really meaningful to say, that's something else.
I first met Pat Metheny in 1973 when he was a 19-year-old teacher at Boston's Berklee College of Music and just about to join Gary Burton's group. His artistic vision and unique voice on the guitar have led to countless awards, 3 gold records, and 15 Grammys, while the Pat Metheny group has won an unprecedented 7 Grammys in a row.
My love of music is what drives the whole thing, and the musicians that I loved the most, I realized, were all musicians who kind of defined their own voice and found a sound that you could tell it was them quickly. As much as I love playing on standards and blues forms and sort of modern jazz great composers, there was a way of playing, a kind of improvisational feeling that, although I could kind of impose it into that zone a little bit, I really wasn't finding material that offered me the chances to really follow through on that improvisational urge that I had. And that was why I started writing tunes. I mean, the thing of being a composer came much later. I mean, it wasn't until I was in my late teens, early 20s that that became a kind of major priority for me. And it was really out of necessity. I needed to find material that could launch this way of playing that I was interested in. There was a tune that I wrote when I was 17 called April Joy. That tune was really what I consider the first real tune I ever wrote that does the thing that I'm talking about. That was the tune that opened that world. Ultimately, what you're finally left with is some kind of a sound. At the core of whatever that sound is, there has to be a certain kind of truth or resonance that's very, very deep to the person that's offering that sound. It's really not that difficult to kind of whip up a thing in the musical kitchen, but it really might not taste that good.
Now, Pat Metheny plays in a really melodic way, but how he approaches those melodies is really unique. I asked him to demonstrate that for us.
So much of what improvising is and the melodic quality that I try to invoke is really just kind of like having destinations that are clear. So if I'm going to get from here to here and the chords are going going to improvise over that. I mean, somehow, even with that, you can sort of hear the, even if you don't hear it,
Absolutely.
it's sort of there. And I think some of that is if you just think it. It's like somehow this can change to, you know, you hear it going there. So once you kind of like have, it's sort of like that's the first sentence that you offer to somebody in a conversation. Once you've established that, then these other notes, which are kind of blues. And that thing is still kind of going on.
Yeah.
And once you've established that, then you can kind of get away with anything. Still going on, and with that I was more or less just adding some extra chords.
Yeah.
And then you know, once you've got that going, then you can add some really weird stuff. Once you've gone that far, then you can go kind of anywhere else. And so on.
An instrument is an instrument. And you're playing it, yes, but it's an instrument for you. And I think a lot of people don't understand that the word instrument isn't just an accident.
That's a very good one. I'm going to steal that one. I like that. Well, I do think that there are musicians who are in love with their instrument to an extreme degree. And I was never that into the guitar. I like the guitar. It's like, you know, I was attracted to it like a billion other kids because of probably the Beatles. And the thing that the guitar represented in 1966 and 65 was certainly coming right up 6th Avenue towards me as a 11, 12-year-old kid then. It was never like, wow, it's the guitar. It was more like the music, and the guitar was a component of that, and I wanted to understand all of it, not just the guitar part. Guitar remains an oddball in a way in the jazz panorama. It's got some real difficulties as an improvisational instrument because of its very limited dynamic range. Dynamics are such an important part. On the other hand, I feel very proud to often be included in a small group of guys that I think over the last 30 years or so have worked really hard to bring the guitar into the improvisational panorama of what's possible in jazz by offering some stuff that really you can't get any other way. If I sit down and play at the piano, or with my limited trumpet playing, or on the guitar, I'm going to play the same thing. I'm going to play it better on the guitar because I can play it better. But it's sort of like the idea for me starts before the instrument, because it's not the guitar that I'm playing, it's the ideas.
Well, time is important to every musician, especially me, as my time with you has run out. But don't be depressed, because next week I'll be fearlessly exploring improvisation from Brazil to Cuba, from blues to country, from hip-hop to pop. I'd like to thank all those nice geniuses who took part, and my producer for Unique, Anna Harrison, who still hasn't recovered from last week's show. If you're brave enough to tune in next week, I'll still be Richard Niles, and I hope you'll join me on BBC Radio 2 next Tuesday night when I'll take you deliciously deep inside improvisation.